of Australia's most legendary engines, the Holden 308 V8, wasn't just an engineering marvel, but also the victim of a corporate conspiracy. For decades, Australians believed their homegrown V8 was a proud national icon, built to battle the toughest conditions in the outback. But behind the curtain, General Motors had other plans. Memos hidden for years, dyno sheets buried in vaults, and secret orders sent from Detroit all paint a darker picture. That Holden's Lion was deliberately caged, while Chevrolet's Stallion was allowed to run free. Welcome to the secret horsepower Cold War GM never wanted you to know about. Forged in the crucible of the 1960s horsepower race, both the Chevy 350 and the Holden 308 were born from the same corporate family, yet destined for radically different fates. The Chevy 350 debuted first, shaking Detroit in 1967 with its raw power and versatility. Just 2 years later, in 1969, Holden introduced the 308, a uniquely Australian 5.0-liter weapon designed not for drag strips or suburban boulevards, but for the brutal reality of outback endurance. But here's the twist. Holden engineers weren't given full access to Chevrolet's research. They weren't told to compete. According to multiple insiders, they were told to differentiate. In other words, don't outshine the American sibling. Former Holden engineer James Mitchell puts it bluntly. We weren't told to innovate. We were told to stay in our lane. The separation wasn't technical, it was corporate. And that's the first crack in the myth. Look closely at the specs and the decisions start to look suspicious. The Holden 308 was designed with a smaller bore and stroke than the Chevy 350, despite Australia's wide open roads practically begging for more displacement. Internal documents now reveal that Holden's engineers proved the block could handle extra capacity with minimal changes, but Detroit ordered revisions. Why? Because the early 308 prototypes on dynos in 1968 were matching the Chevy 350 in output, and that was unacceptable. Officially, the numbers look straightforward. The Holden 308 made 240 horsepower, the Chevy 350, 295 horsepower. End of story? Right? Not even close. Hidden dyno sheets from Holden's Fisherman's Bend facility tell a different tale. Prototype 308s were producing as much as 310 horsepower. That's right, on equal footing, the 308 wasn't behind. It was right there with Chevy's golden child. But those numbers were never published. Instead, the 308 was quietly detuned. A retired GM executive admitted off the record no Holden V8 could exceed its Chevrolet counterpart. That was the policy. And here's the irony. On paper, the 308 looked like the underdog, but in the details, it carried secret advantages. Many trims came with 4-bolt mains, even though the brochures claimed otherwise. Its cylinder heads flowed so efficiently that even Chevrolet's engineers quietly took notes. And while the Chevy 350 was heavier, the Holden 308 tipped the scales about 30 pounds lighter, giving it a better power-to-weight ratio in real-world conditions. None of this was marketed. Why? Because GM's hierarchy demanded that the 350 always look superior. From an engineering standpoint, the Holden motor was a masterpiece waiting to be unleashed. Its bore and stroke ratio gave it a rev-happy, efficient character that made it perfect for high RPM endurance runs. Its oiling system featured subtle modifications that boosted flow to the camshaft bearings by 15%, a detail designed for brutal conditions like Bathurst, but never highlighted in glossy brochures. And then there were the cylinder heads. With a 12-degree valve angle compared to Chevy's 23, the Holden 308 had better quench, better flame travel, and far superior efficiency. Flow benches showed 265 CFM, numbers that rivaled or beat American counterparts, yet GM's official marketing understated them by over 10%. And then of course comes the legend that could have changed everything, the Phase 4. This was the mythical high-performance 308 variant that never saw the light of day. With forged rods capable of handling Corvette-level stress and a red line north of 7,200 RPM, the Phase 4 could have been Holden's masterpiece, a giant killer in the global V8 scene. In tests, even with identical cam profiles, the 308 produced a flatter, wider torque curve than the 350. It wasn't weaker. It wasn't a compromise. It was being shackled on purpose. But the most shocking chapter came in 1973 with something known only as Project Wombat. Holden engineers secretly built a high-output version of the 308 fitted with hot cams and reworked heads. The result? 340 horsepower. Back-to-back tests showed it actually beating the Chevy 350 at a remote track in Melbourne. The celebration didn't last long. Within 2 days, Detroit ordered the project dead. Executives flew in from the US. All documentation was destroyed. The message was clear. The 308 would never be allowed to surpass the 350. So why would GM sabotage its own engine? The answer is simple and brutal. Money. GM's global strategy relied on exporting American engines like the 350 across multiple markets. If the Australian 308 proved to be superior, it risked undermining the dominance of Chevrolet's Small Block, the cash cow of the entire division. A leaked memo from 1975 ranked GM regions by performance priority. Australia was deliberately placed below the US. No matter how good the 308 could be, it would never be allowed to outshine Chevrolet. But here's the part Detroit never expected. While they worked to silence the potential of the 308, the truth still slipped through. Race teams began to notice that even detuned, the 308s lasted longer under punishment than their American cousins. Peter Brock's team discovered their engines were lasting 22 hours longer before needing rebuildings than comparable 350s. Engineers whispered about how the geometry of the 308 gave it a natural durability edge, but speaking publicly was dangerous. One insider revealed, "We were told if we released that data, our part supply would disappear." This wasn't just a rivalry of horsepower, it was a battle of philosophy, aggressive Australian innovation suppressed by corporate politics. And as the years passed, whispers about uncorked 308s, ones freed from GM's artificial limits, spread through workshops across Australia. Privately tested against maxed out 350s, the results were often shockingly close. Sometimes the Holden even came ahead. And that brings us to the collector market today, where truth finally has a way of resurfacing. Original 308 red motor blocks, especially the so-called Friday afternoon engines, built when QC was loose and restrictions were bypassed, are now worth double what Chevy 350s fetch. Underground tuners have uncovered and preserved Bathurst papers, technical manuals supposedly destroyed by GM that revealed the real flow numbers and oil mods hidden from the public. And every time one of these 308s hits the dyno, the myth that Chevy was always on top gets a little weaker. Because the truth is simple. The Holden 308 wasn't a second-class V8. It was a world-class engine, shackled for political reasons, buried by corporate hierarchy, and only now getting the recognition it deserves. But the story doesn't end here, because while the 308 may have been muzzled, its DNA lived on in ways GM never admitted. And what happened next proves just how deeply Holden's brilliance shaped the future of the V8. Because what most people don't realize is that even though GM tried to bury the 308, its genetic code refused to die. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Holden engineers quietly carried lessons from the outlawed Phase 4 and Project Wombat into engines that powered everything from Bathurst racers to family sedans. The restricted 308s that rolled off production lines were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the skin, the block, the heads, and the oiling system all carried a silent promise. Unlock me, and I'll give you everything. And Australian tuners heard that call loud and clear. By the 1980s, backyard mechanics were turning humble 308s into monsters. Stroker gets pushed them beyond 355 cubic inches. Hot cams woke up the airflow, and suddenly engines that were rated for 240 horsepower were making 450 on dynos. And that wasn't magic. That was Holden's buried engineering finally breathing. And meanwhile, in the States, Chevy's 350 was still the poster child, plastered across Camaros, Corvettes, and trucks. But here's the kicker. When GM began exporting Holden platforms for cars like the Pontiac GTO and later the Chevy SS, the DNA of the 308 was riding shotgun. The lessons learned in Australia, the head geometry, the durability tricks, the oiling mods, found their way into GM's global V8 architecture. Officially, they'd never admit it, but compare design notes side by side, and the fingerprints are undeniable. And this is where the story turns from corporate sabotage to poetic justice. Because while GM executives in Detroit thought they could control the narrative, car culture had other ideas. Bathurst victories cemented the 308's legend. Street racers built reputations on sleeper Commodores that left American imports gasping. And collectors began to pay premiums for original blocks that were supposedly inferior. Inferior. Tell that to the dyno sheets that keep surfacing. Unshackled 308s still embarrassing big-name small blocks half a century later. So think about what that means. A so-called second-tier Australian V8, designed under restrictions, still has the muscle to rival one of the most celebrated engines in American history. That's not just engineering, it's rebellion cast in iron. And it raises the question, how many other stories like this are buried in corporate vaults waiting to be told? So here's the takeaway. Don't buy the polished brochure version of history. The Holden 308 wasn't just an engine, it was a symbol of what happens when raw innovation collides with corporate fear. And today, every surviving 308 on the road is living proof that passion beats politics. And if you're watching this right now, here's your call to action. Dig deeper, question the official story, and celebrate the machines that weren't just built to sell cars, but built to defy limits. Because engines like the 308 remind us, true horsepower can't be silenced forever.